Something is happening inside the gaming world right now that nobody at Microsoft saw coming at the speed it arrived. Not a gradual erosion of market share that shows up as a rounding error in quarterly platform reports. Not a fringe movement of technically sophisticated users making ideological choices about open source software that the mainstream gaming community watches from a distance without participating. Something faster than that. Something louder. Something that is pulling gamers away from Windows in numbers that have triggered emergency conversations at Microsoft that its leadership desperately wished it wasn't having, and that Bill Gates, whose fortune was built in meaningful part on Windows becoming the dominant platform for personal computing, including gaming, is reportedly struggling to fully process. Gamers are leaving Windows for SteamOS by the millions, deliberately, publicly, enthusiastically, and with a momentum that every data point currently available suggests is accelerating rather than plateauing. The Reddit communities, the YouTube channels, the Discord servers, the Twitch streams, the gaming forums where real purchasing and platform decisions get made by real people who spend real money on their hobby are saturated with a conversation that has shifted from whether SteamOS is viable for serious gaming to why anyone serious about gaming would choose to stay on Windows given everything Windows has become. Valve's SteamOS, the Linux-based operating system that powers the Steam Deck handheld gaming device, and that Valve has now made available for installation on desktop gaming PCs, has crossed a threshold that the gaming industry's most experienced analysts had projected was still years away. It has crossed from enthusiast curiosity into mainstream gaming platform contention. The numbers are real. The migration is real. And the implications for Microsoft's gaming strategy, for Windows' position as the assumed default platform for PC gaming, and for the commercial architecture that Windows 12 is being built around are more serious than Microsoft's public communications are willing to acknowledge. Here is exactly why this is happening. Here is exactly what Valve built that Microsoft failed to build. Here is exactly what the numbers show. Here is why Bill Gates' shock is a rational response to watching a moat he assumed was permanent disappear faster than anyone predicted. And here is why the gaming abandonment of Windows is not an isolated platform story, but the leading edge of a much larger shift that should concern every Windows user, regardless of whether they have ever played a single video game. To understand why gamers are leaving Windows in record numbers, you have to understand what gamers have been enduring on Windows over the same period that every other Windows user has been enduring it. Because gamers experience Windows problems with a specific intensity that general users do not. Gaming pushes hardware harder than almost any other consumer computing workload. It demands consistent, predictable performance. It runs for hours at a time in sessions where an unexpected interruption is not merely inconvenient, but actively costly in terms of progress, competitive standing, and the money spent on the gaming session itself. And it requires the operating system to stay out of the way in a manner that Windows has been progressively failing to deliver. Windows Update has been a source of gaming-specific rage for years that has no equivalent in other user communities. The pattern is familiar to every serious PC gamer. You are 90 minutes into a competitive online match. You have invested real time and real focus into a gaming session that matters to you. Windows decides this is the moment to restart for an update. Or Windows decides to throttle your CPU in the background because its update download process is competing with your game for system resources. Or Windows decides to run its telemetry compilation tasks, its AI background processing, its behavioral data collection operations, precisely during the high-performance gaming session, when your hardware has the least capacity to absorb background workload without performance impact. Microsoft's response to years of gaming-specific Windows Update complaints has been to add a gaming mode setting that is supposed to suppress background processes during active gaming sessions. Gaming mode exists. It reduces some categories of Windows background activity during detected gaming sessions. It does not eliminate them. It does not prevent Windows Update from deciding that your gaming session is an appropriate moment for background download activity. It does not prevent the telemetry and AI processing loads that independent researchers documented as responsible for significant CPU and battery overhead from consuming resources that your game needs for consistent frame rates and response times. Gamers have known this for years. They have posted about it for years. They have built entire communities around Windows optimization guides, specifically for gaming, stripping out background processes, disabling telemetry, reducing Windows to the minimum viable operating environment that allows games to run without interference. The existence of these communities and the size and activity levels they have maintained are themselves evidence that Windows default configuration is incompatible with serious gaming in ways that require significant user intervention to correct. What Windows 11 added to this existing frustration was the layer of privacy violations, surveillance architecture, and forced commercial relationships that the rest of the Windows user base was also experiencing, but concentrated through the lens of a user community that already had years of documented legitimate grievance about Windows performance behavior. and was therefore primed to make the connection between Windows' treatment of users generally and Windows' treatment of gamers specifically. The recall scandal hit gaming communities with particular force. The idea that Windows was taking screenshots of their screens every few seconds landed differently for gamers than it did for general users. Gamers understand screen capture. They use it deliberately for content creation, for sharing memorable moments, for streaming. The thought of Windows taking that capability and running it continuously, storing everything in a database that security researchers had documented as trivially accessible to any malware on the system, immediately connected to a gaming-specific fear that the stream of gameplay screenshots could expose account credentials, payment information, in-game chat content, and personal communications that appear on screen during gaming sessions. The gaming community's reaction to recall was not abstract privacy concern. It was personal and specific, and it spread through gaming communities faster than through almost any other user demographic. Then came the documented battery drain and background processing overhead. The revelation that Windows 11's AI infrastructure, telemetry systems, and synchronization processes were consuming between 18 and 30% of system resources in the background landed in gaming communities as confirmation of something gamers had been experiencing as unexplained performance inconsistency for months. Frame rate drops that appeared without obvious cause, CPU usage spikes during gaming sessions that didn't correspond to game activity. The performance headroom that should have been available on capable hardware not being there when games needed it. Researchers connecting these experiences to measurable background process overhead gave gamers a documented explanation for performance problems they had been experiencing without being able to fully diagnose. This is the context into which Valve dropped SteamOS for desktop PC installation. Not into a community of Windows users who were broadly satisfied with their platform and needed to be convinced to try something different. Into a community that had been accumulating legitimate, specific, gaming-relevant grievances about Windows for years, and that was actively looking for a credible alternative when Valve provided one. Valve's credibility with the gaming community is the asset that made SteamOS's desktop expansion possible in a way that previous Linux gaming initiatives had failed to achieve. Valve is not a privacy advocacy organization or an open-source ideological movement. Valve is the company that runs Steam, the platform where the overwhelming majority of PC gamers purchase, manage, and play their games. Valve is the company that built and continuously updates the game libraries that represent years of gaming investment for most PC gamers. Valve is the company that created the Steam Deck, the device that proved Linux gaming at scale was not a theoretical possibility, but an operational reality that millions of paying customers were already using daily. When Valve says SteamOS on desktop PCs is ready for serious gaming, because Valve's business does not depend on which operating system runs Steam, but rather on Steam continuing to be where gaming happens. The Proton compatibility layer that Valve has built and continuously refined is the technical foundation that makes the SteamOS migration viable at the scale it is now occurring. Proton is a translation layer that allows Windows games to run on Linux with performance that ranges from indistinguishable from native Windows performance to close enough that the difference is irrelevant for the vast majority of gaming experiences. The ProtonDB community database, maintained by gamers who test and report their actual experiences running specific titles through Proton on Linux, documents thousands of game titles with gold or platinum compatibility ratings, meaning they work on Linux without meaningful configuration effort and with performance matching or approaching the Windows experience. The scope of Proton compatibility in 2025 is genuinely remarkable when measured against where Linux gaming stood just 5 years ago. The most popular competitive multiplayer titles, the massive open-world games that represent the biggest production investments in gaming history, the independent titles that define gaming culture at any given moment, the legacy titles that gamers return to repeatedly across years, the overwhelming majority of the Steam library that represents actual gaming behavior rather than theoretical catalog size, is playable on SteamOS through Proton at quality levels that serious gamers find genuinely satisfactory. Games using easy anti-cheat and BattlEye implementations that are not configured for Linux compatibility remain unavailable on SteamOS in many cases. Specific competitive titles, in the first-person shooter category where anti-cheat architecture most frequently creates Linux incompatibility, represent genuine barriers for gamers whose primary gaming investment is in those specific titles. But the size of this genuinely incompatible category is substantially smaller than the general public impression of Linux gaming incompatibility would suggest, and it has been shrinking as Valve has worked with anti-cheat vendors and as game developers have responded to the commercial reality of the Steam Deck's success by ensuring their titles work on SteamOS. Gamers who have done the practical audit of their actual gaming libraries, the games they actually play, rather than every title they have ever owned, frequently discover that the incompatibility rate in their personal library is significantly lower than the general incompatibility narrative implies. Many find it is zero. The performance story on SteamOS has become one of the most powerful drivers of the migration because it directly addresses the core frustration that Windows background process overhead created. SteamOS, as a purpose-built gaming operating system with a stripped-down Linux foundation, runs dramatically less background activity than Windows 11 in its default state. There are no telemetry sessions competing with game processes for CPU cycles. There is no AI background infrastructure maintaining perpetual readiness states at the expense of gaming headroom. There are no behavioral data collection processes packaging and queuing transmissions during high-intensity gaming sessions. The operating system gets out of the way in the manner that Windows gaming communities have been demanding for years and that Windows has never fully delivered. Independent benchmarking of identical gaming hardware running Windows 11 versus SteamOS on the same game titles has documented performance differences that land in a specific pattern. Average frame rates are broadly comparable between the platforms on most titles, often within 5 to 10% in either direction depending on the specific game and configuration. The difference that gamers find more significant than average performance is consistency. Frame time variance, which is the measurement of how consistently the system delivers frames rather than just how many it delivers on average, is frequently better on SteamOS than on Windows 11, because the absence of background processes competing for system resources eliminates the interruption events that create frame time spikes and the stuttering that gamers experience as the most disruptive performance problem. A game running at an average of 100 frames per second with occasional stutters caused by Windows background activity interruptions is a worse gaming experience than the same game running at an average of 95 frames per second with highly consistent frame delivery. SteamOS delivers the latter profile more reliably than Windows 11 in its default configuration. Gamers who have made the migration and posted their experiences describe the difference not in benchmark numbers but in subjective experience language. The game feels smoother. The input response feels more consistent. The session feels uninterrupted in a way that Windows sessions increasingly did not. The Steam Deck's role in this migration cannot be overstated because it accomplished something that years of Linux gaming advocacy had failed to achieve. It put SteamOS in the hands of millions of gamers who had never thought about Linux, never had an ideological position about open source software, never engaged with the technical communities where Linux gaming had been discussed. Steam Deck owners used SteamOS because their handheld ran it, discovered that their games worked, discovered that the experience was good, and arrived at their desktop gaming PC with a personal experiential basis for trusting that SteamOS was a genuine gaming platform rather than a platform that required compromise. Valve's installation support for SteamOS on desktop hardware, which has made the process of installing SteamOS on a gaming PC dramatically more accessible than previous Linux gaming setup experiences, arrived into a user base that had been pre-educated by Steam Deck ownership about what SteamOS could deliver. The conversion pipeline from Steam Deck owner to SteamOS desktop user is one of the most efficient platform migration pathways in gaming history, because every step of the trust-building process that would normally be required to convince a gamer to leave Windows had already been accomplished by the Steam Deck itself. The numbers that are making Microsoft nervous are not speculative projections. They are platform measurement data from sources with visibility into actual gaming behavior at scale. Steam's monthly hardware and software survey, which samples the active Steam user base and reports operating system usage statistics, has recorded Linux and SteamOS usage climbing through levels that the platform's historical trajectory would have taken years to reach, in timelines measured in months. The rate of change in the survey data has accelerated precisely in the periods that align with the Windows privacy scandals and the SteamOS desktop installation availability, confirming that the migration is driven by the push of Windows failures and the pull of SteamOS is readiness simultaneously. Gaming hardware sales data has added a dimension to the picture that goes beyond platform preference surveys. Gaming PC builds documented on hardware enthusiast platforms show increasing proportions of SteamOS as the intended operating system for new builds. When gamers building new high-performance gaming systems, who have the maximum freedom to choose any platform because they are starting from scratch rather than migrating existing systems, are choosing SteamOS as their target operating system for new hardware in growing numbers, it signals something more significant than dissatisfied users looking for alternatives. It signals that, for a meaningful and growing portion of the gaming community, Windows is no longer the default assumption for a gaming PC. It is one option among options that must be evaluated on its merits. The content creator dimension of the gaming community has been particularly impactful in accelerating the migration. Gaming YouTube channels, Twitch streamers, and gaming content creators whose audiences range from tens of thousands to millions of subscribers have been producing SteamOS migration content at volumes and quality levels that have no historical precedent in Linux gaming media. These creators are not Linux advocates by background or identity. They are gaming content creators who cover what their audiences find relevant, and what their audiences have been finding relevant is the question of whether Windows is still the right choice for gaming. The migration content from these creators reaches audiences that no Linux advocacy community has ever been able to reach effectively, because it arrives through trusted gaming voices rather than through technical communities that general gaming audiences perceive as outside their identity. A gaming YouTuber with 5 million subscribers who posts a video documenting their personal migration from Windows to SteamOS and their genuine experience of gaming performance improvements reaches 5 million people who trust that creators' gaming judgment in a way that no amount of technical documentation from Linux communities could replicate. The content creator amplification of the SteamOS migration has been the difference between a measurable trend and a cultural moment. Bill Gates' shock at this development is rooted in something that goes deeper than the immediate market share numbers. Gates built Microsoft's dominance by understanding and capitalizing on platform lock-in. The insight that made Windows dominant was not that Windows was the best possible operating system in an objective sense. It was that Windows became the platform where software was written, which made it the platform users needed to access that software, which made it the platform where more software was written in a self-reinforcing cycle, that created a moat around Windows that was defined by ecosystem rather than by intrinsic product quality. Gaming was supposed to be the ultimate expression of that moat in the consumer space. Games were written for Windows because gamers used Windows. Gamers used Windows because their games ran on Windows. DirectX, Microsoft's gaming graphics API, was the technical infrastructure that tied game development to Windows in ways that made the platform relationship feel permanent. Xbox's integration with Windows gaming through Play Anywhere titles, Game Pass, and the Windows gaming identity was supposed to deepen the gaming moat in the same way that CUDA deepened NVIDIA's AI moat. Valve dismantled this architecture with a patience and technical investment that Microsoft did not take seriously until the results were impossible to dismiss. Proton did not appear overnight. It was built over years of sustained engineering investment by Valve teams, whose mission was specifically to make the game library that defines PC gaming accessible on Linux. Every year of Proton development, that Microsoft dismissed as an enthusiast project that would never reach mainstream viability, was a year of investment that brought mainstream viability closer. By the time Microsoft's product teams were forced to acknowledge that SteamOS was a genuine competitive threat to Windows and gaming, Valve had already built the compatibility infrastructure, the hardware proof point in the Steam Deck, the content creator distribution channel, and the community trust that made the threat operational rather than theoretical. The DirectX moat, which Microsoft had treated as permanent, turned out to be less durable than the software moat that Valve built through Steam's relationship with gamers. Gamers' primary platform loyalty is to their game libraries, their friends lists, their achievement histories, and the social infrastructure of gaming that Steam hosts. That loyalty is to Valve's ecosystem, not to Windows. When Valve made that ecosystem fully accessible on SteamOS, it removed the primary reason that gaming-centric Windows users had to stay on Windows. The Microsoft-specific gaming infrastructure, DirectX implementations, Xbox integration, Windows gaming features turned out to be secondary concerns when the core gaming experience was equally available on the alternative platform. Microsoft, as a response to the SteamOS gaming exodus, has followed the same inadequate pattern as its responses to every other category of Windows user defection. Statements emphasizing Windows gaming features, references to the DirectX ecosystem and exclusive gaming capabilities, commitments to gaming-focused Windows improvements, framing of the migration as a fringe movement that does not reflect the broader gaming community's preferences. None of these responses address the actual reasons gamers are leaving. They address the gaming features. Gamers are not leaving because Windows lacks gaming features. They are leaving because Windows' relationship with its users has become hostile enough that the features are no longer sufficient compensation for what Windows has become. The gaming community's departure from Windows carries implications that extend to Microsoft's Windows 12 strategy in ways that the company's planning teams are actively managing. Windows 12's commercial architecture, the tiered subscription model, the ambient behavioral intelligence collection, the The continuous value extraction framework that leaked internal documents describe was designed around the assumption of a captive user base whose gaming dependency on Windows made platform switching prohibitively costly. That assumption is eroding in real time, as Valve demonstrates that the gaming dependency can be transferred to a platform that does not impose the commercial and surveillance architecture that Windows 12 is being built around. If the gaming community successfully establishes SteamOS as a mainstream gaming platform before Windows 12 launches, Microsoft's tiered subscription conversion model loses one of its most reliable captive user segments. Gamers who might have accepted Windows 12's subscription architecture reluctantly because leaving would mean losing access to their games will instead have a proven, Valve-supported alternative that preserves their game library access on a platform that does not impose subscription requirements for basic operating system functionality or treat their behavioral data as a commercial asset to be exploited. The urgency in Microsoft is internal gaming strategy. Conversations right now is not about frame rates or DirectX features or Xbox integration quality. It is about whether the gaming community's departure from Windows will cross the cultural threshold. It is about whether the gaming community's departure from Windows will cross the cultural threshold. It is about whether the gaming community's departure from Windows will cross the cultural threshold before Windows 12's commercial architecture can capture the gaming user base and the subscription relationships that Microsoft's revenue projections depend on. The race is between Valve's migration momentum and Microsoft's launch timeline. And the migration is ahead. For gamers currently on Windows who are watching this unfold and trying to make sense of what it means for their own platform decisions, the practical guidance is direct. The migration is not a commitment to ideology. It is not a permanent, irreversible decision that closes doors. SteamOS can be installed alongside Windows in a dual boot configuration that preserves Windows access for the titles that remain incompatible with SteamOS while giving you the full SteamOS gaming experience for everything else. Most gamers who have tried this configuration find that their SteamOS boot becomes their primary gaming environment within weeks, and their Windows boot becomes an increasingly occasional fallback that they visit less frequently as Proton compatibility continues improving. Check your own game library against ProtonDB before concluding that SteamOS cannot serve your gaming needs. The database is specific, user-maintained, and regularly updated. The actual compatibility rate for the games that constitute your real gaming behavior, not the theoretical compatibility rate for your entire historical library, is almost certainly higher than you expect. Many gamers who check discover that every title they have played in the past 6 months is gold or platinum rated on ProtonDB. What Valve has built is the answer to the question that millions of gamers have been asking for years. Can I have the gaming experience I want without being on a platform that surveils me, charges me subscriptions for functionality I used to own, drains my system's performance with background processes serving Microsoft's commercial interests, and treats my usage patterns as a behavioral data asset to be commercially exploited? The answer is yes. The evidence is in the migration numbers. The evidence is in the benchmark comparisons. The evidence is in the gaming community forums, where people who made the move are describing what they found on the other side. Bill Gates is shocked because he built a moat around Windows that he believed was permanent. Gaming was the deepest part of that moat. Valve just drained it, and the millions of gamers currently crossing to the other side are not going back. The question for every Windows gamer reading this right now is the same question it always is when a dominant platform begins losing its hold. Not whether the migration is happening. It is. Not whether SteamOS is ready. It is. But whether the reasons that kept you on Windows still outweigh the reasons that are driving everyone else away. For millions of gamers, the calculation just changed. For the first time in the history of PC gaming, it changed in favor of leaving, and Microsoft is still trying to figure out how to make them want to stay.